Sigo savoirs, what mirato, rane Jets, no le mieux de votre sanazere, yati kubuwe, canadien de what chota. Je souhaite la bienvenue à cette dernière activité de l'Observatoire de la traduction autochtone pour l'année 2022-2023. D'autres activités se tiendront l'an prochain. Les premiers mots que j'ai prononcés étaient en Ganyagea, ou moi, comme je l'ai fait à quelques reprises pour rappeler le territoire sur lequel on se trouve. Donc, je me présente. Je m'appelle René Lemieux, je suis professeur en traduction au département d'études françaises. J'organise l'événement d'aujourd'hui avec l'aide de William Roy, étudiant la maîtrise en traductologie à Concordia et devient qu'à la Liberté, doctorante en études sémiotiques à l'UQAM, et je les remercie tous les deux, ainsi que Hélène Després de Figura, pour l'organisation de l'événement, qui s'inscrit dans les activités aussi de son nouveau pôle à Figura, qu'on a appelé le pôle en traduction et traductologie, dont la majorité des membres sont à Concordia. Now in English, my first words were in Ganyagea or Moa to remind us of the land we are on. My name is René Lemieux. I'm a professor in translation studies at the Département d'études françaises. I am organizing this event with the help of William Roy, MA student in translation studies at Concordia, and Bianca La Liberté, PhD student in semiotic studies at UQAM. I want to thank them for their help, and this event is held with the support of Figura, so I'd like to thank Hélène Després also, and is part of the new pole in translation and translation studies based in Concordia. So I would like to present Chercheur Llanes-Ortiz. Chercheur is a Maya scholar from Yucatan, Mexico, currently working as an assistant professor of indigenous studies in the Faculty of Arts and Science at Bishop's University in Canada. He was recently appointed Canada Research Chair in Digital Indigenicities. His research examines the creative ways in which Indigenous peoples employ digital media and technologies to reclaim, revitalize, and mobilize their linguistic, historical, and contemporary heritage. He has also investigated how Indigenous knowledge is represented and integrated in intercultural education projects in Latin America. His work has also been concerned with the role of Indigenous artistic forms, music, cinema, performance, in language revitalization, anti-racism, and decolonization. In these research endeavors, he has always worked collaboratively with NGOs and indigenous organizations in Mexico, Ecuador, Belize, and Guatemala. Today, in his talk, aanil, tesarrooyo, Chercheur will reflect about the challenges and lessons learned during his involvement as an intercultural facilitator and researcher working with non-governmental people organizations and Maya local organization and promoter of his home region, the Yucatan Peninsula.
Merci beaucoup. Javaris Botikich, Bisabelish, Keshigayanaktesh, Hazuskim, Light, and Sibotikich, Yavach Kimakola, Veglai, Jusbotikich, René, Viola le Pait Anil, Galinsigbat Yetele. Shoknalo, Yolal Helas Balo, Yanuyila Yetelu Umeya, Kupetko to men Helas much meaho to Lumil Yucatan, to no Lumil Mexico. Inside in Chimpolal, Shan Tial Le Yash Taho Tile Le Lumina, Le Lumina, Ku Abati Canada, Beora. Huge bin lumen tile Ganyagea, yetele wenda to, yetele amenakio, yetele helas ulag masiwalkaho, way akil akpetenil. I wish you all a good day. I hope that you are having a good afternoon. I'm really thankful to René for the invitation to speak to you today a little bit about some of the work that several groups and organizations do in the Yucatan and Mexico. I also wanted to begin by offering my acknowledgement to the peoples of this land, to the first peoples of this land, the Ganyagea, the Wendat, the Abenaki, and other First Nations. The title of my presentation is éext aanil, tesarrooyo. What it means is the translation of development. I'm using here the Mayanized form of desarrollo, which is Spanish for development, which is in Maya would be tesarrooyo, in which the word acquires the phonetics and the intonation of the Maya language. I'm going to start talking a little bit about my native language. So I am a speaker of Maya tant, which means literally the Maya language. So my language is called Maya in the language, which is part of the Yucatec branch, where is grouped along with Mopan, Lacandon, and Itzan. These other three languages are different from Maya tant, but are closely related. And the Yucatec branch is, for those of you who are linguists or, interested in linguistic classifications, the Yucatec branch is one of 5 branches in which Maya languages organized or grouped, right? So we have the Ichean branch, we have the Tzeltalan branch, we have the Canjobalan branch, the Huastecan branch, and these are 5 or the most important branches in which close to 32 different Maya languages are organized or grouped, right? Maya language is found written in hieroglyphs from the 10th century of the Common Era. And by that, I mean that the language in which most of the hieroglyphic writing is written is no longer spoken in the Maya region. So that language is considered, or is called by archaeologists, Classic Maya. Is closely related to another Maya language, which is called Chol, and also even closer to another language that is called Chorti. And that is the language in which most of the inscriptions that are currently being interpreted and decodified are written in. But in the Maya region, and that is my region, the peninsula of the Yucatan, archaeologists and epigraphists have been able to establish that some of the writing, which is phonetic in nature, right? So each one of the symbols in the hieroglyphic alphabet correspond to a syllable or to a logogram, but these are read phonetically rather than interpreted as icons or as symbols. And because of this phonetic nature of the hieroglyphic writing, archaeologists and epigraphists have been able to establish that that language in which these inscriptions are written is very closely related to Yucatec Maya or Maya tant, which means that the language has been written for at least 10 centuries already, first in hieroglyphs, later in Latin characters. And as I said, the name of the language was recorded as Maya since the 16th century. So with colonization, the language was initially embraced by colonial authorities, unlike other parts of the Americas where colonization displaced indigenous languages. In the case of Mexico, and in a few regions and relation to certain indigenous nations, the Spanish were quick to adopt this language for their own purposes, right? So Spanish authorities, both religious and civil, adopted and used Maya for their own agendas, right? The friars, the missionaries, very quickly started studying the language. They compiled dictionaries. We have at least 6 or 7 colonial dictionaries compiled by the Franciscan order. And the intention of recording this language was, first of all, to understand how it worked. In that sense, the Franciscans were some of the first linguistic scholars of the Maya language. But on the other hand, they wanted to use it very intentionally to evangelize. And there's a very interesting book for those of you who are interested in historical linguistics, written by William F. Hanks from Berkeley University, where he analyzes those colonial dictionaries and some of the entries, and he's able to establish the way in which the Franciscans sort of used the internal logics of the language to create concepts that were useful for Christianity in their evangelization process. So for whatever reason, not just religious authorities, but also civil authorities also use the language. In the archives of Seville in Spain, there are hundreds of documents written in Maya tant with Latin characters that document community decisions, private wills. There are also some sale certificates for plots of land, or different types of documents that today historians are able to read. All of that documentation was kept in the colonial archives of Spain, and many of these documents demonstrate how quickly interpretation of legal concepts happen in both directions. Unfortunately, I don't have a lot of examples of that, but you can see that the language was influencing colonial administration at the same time as colonial administration was influencing and reshaping the language. So there was a background of cross influence when it comes to Yucatec Maya language. My people continue to use the Latin characters. So hieroglyphic writing was exterminated, was very systematically eliminated, because the Franciscans were fearful that that language was used to still worship the devil, very systematically persecuted and killed all the people who knew how to read and write Maya hieroglyphs. But my ancestors continued to use Latin characters to write their own books. Many of those books were written outside of the sphere of influence of the Franciscans, and those books are known as the books of Chilambalam. And this is a facsimile image of one such book. This is from the Chilambalam of Chumayel, one of the most famous books, and it integrates different aspects of representation. You can see a little bit of, you can see a figure with a crown, which stands for one of the Maya rulers, and there are some cosmological, astronomical information also. Many of these books were passed from generation to generation, copied several times, and we still have approximately 12 or 14 of those books written in Maya, in Latin characters, that document a lot of the old knowledge that my ancestors had. And the use of Maya was so prominent in the Yucatan Peninsula that it was de facto the lingua franca in the region. All throughout the colonial period, during the first 150 years of the independent life of Mexico, the Maya language was used on a daily basis. Everybody coming to the Yucatan Peninsula had to learn Maya. Lebanese immigrants learn Maya. Catalonian immigrants learn Maya. Chinese immigrants learn Maya. Korean immigrants learn Maya. So everybody have a certain knowledge of the language way until the 1950s. To the extent that the way we speak Spanish in the Yucatan is very heavily influenced by my language and is known colloquially or informally in the region as Español Guayé, which means the Spanish of here, right? Guayé means here in Maya time. So this is just to give you a sense that, how some of the processes, or a lot of the processes that I'm going to be talking about in more depth, happen. What is the context? This is something, these two slides that I presented you tell a story that unfortunately very few people in the Yucatan know, right? So this is knowledge that I have been gathering, but there is a notion that the language was exterminated or displaced by colonial authorities in the early 16th century, when in fact, the language was so powerful that it had to be used, was continuously used all the way into the 1950s, when, virtually half of the population in the Yucatan Peninsula will communicate in the Maya language. And it's only in the last 50 years, with the expansion of primary school education and the systematic establishment of certain ideologies promoted by the Mexican state, the Maya language has lost a lot of ground. And I'll, present you some of those numbers. So this is the Yucatan Peninsula. This is the region that I call home. This is roughly 1/10 of the surface of the Quebec province. So Quebec has 1.5 million square kilometers. The Yucatan Peninsula has close to 150,000 square kilometers. It's not very big, but still it approximates the extension of Wales and England, right? If the Yucatan Peninsula were a country, it will be approximately bigger than Bangladesh, Greece, Bulgaria, Nicaragua, or Guatemala, or Hungary. My way of saying this is not a small country, right? And in the Yucatan, as I said, In the last 50 years, there's been an important decrease in the number of people who speak the language. According to some historians, in the late 19th century, 90% of the population spoke the language, used the language on a daily basis. And as I said, all the immigrants had to learn the language. In the census, the first official record of the number of speakers, it appears at 52%, which you can say, okay, so where did the other 40% of people go? There was a war, there was a revolution in Mexico at the beginning of the 20th century. So that might explain a little bit the difference in numbers, but the revolution didn't start in the Yucatan until 1914. So that number is a little bit biased, but anyway, that's the reference we have. So the language holds its power over the peninsula until the late 20th century. But still, in the 1990 census, it stood at 34%. And in the early portion of this century, it decreased even more. And in 2015, the census reported that only 18% of the population in the peninsula spoke the language. In the map that we can see here, we see some of those green dots are places where more than 80% of the population spoke the language. And this is a map produced in 2006, so the beginning of this century. Red dots represent communities or towns where more than 50% of the population spoke the language, but less than 80%. But still, you can see, it was more or less present in the whole territory. This is a number from 2015. Close to 800,000 people in Mexico spoke the language. 9% of them were in Mérida. That's the capital of the Yucatan and is the largest city in the region. That's approximately 1.2, 1.1 million people in that area. It's known as Hope in Maya. And the second largest city where Maya speakers concentrate is Cancun, which is probably some of the most famous cities, especially for Canadians. And Montreal is, you can hear a lot of Quebecois on the streets of Cancun. Yeah. Now that I've been here, I know that that's Quebecois. Okay, and there's approximately another 15,000 people in the San Francisco Bay Area in California, which is known as California, Yucatan, California. So in my case, even though I'm a speaker of Maya, I'm a late speaker of Maya. So I was born and raised in Kul, Maya name of my town, Tikul, and I'm the son of Maya professionals. My parents, both my parents are the first in their families who went to school. My father has a degree in agronomy as a technician of agronomy, and my mother was able to get a certificate as a secretary. But I'm the grandson also of Maya peasants. And in the Yucatan, and especially when it comes to Maya people, identities are tied to the land through farming or peasantry, right? So there's a whole cultural complex that revolves around agriculture. We are horticulturalists, like the Haudenosaunee, in some ways, and we have that in common. But we also have practices of hunting and gathering. So this farming doesn't mean we don't hunt or we don't gather, right? There's a complex system in place. But saying that you are, in my case, that I'm the grandson of Maya peasants is a way of establishing my lineage and my connection with Maya heritage. Still, growing up, because of these histories of discrimination against the language, I didn't speak the language when I was a kid. My parents didn't speak to me in Maya. They spoke among themselves in Maya, but they would rarely talk to us, me and my siblings, in the language. So it was only when I was in my mid-teens, when I was 14 or 15, that I started actively re-engaging with my language. And at the time, I was going out into communities and trying to talk to the elders in some of those communities, but with a very thin grasp of the language. And gradually, I become more and more fluent. And then I started living and studying away. But also part of my identity, and also what is going to show in the experiences that I'm going to be talking about here, is my connection with NGOs and social movements in Maya Peninsula, right? This is the place from where I approach a lot of these questions of translation, how my political involvement in many of these NGOs opened the door for me to use a little of my language skills in a political setting. So a lot of the translation that happened in this period that I'm going to be telling you about is also somehow mediated or filtered by that political affiliation, right? I'm an anthropologist through and through. I did my bachelor in anthropology. I did my master's in anthropology of development. I did my PhD in anthropology, and I've never worked in an anthropology department, but I'm an anthropologist, and that's also from where I have been approaching many of these questions. And finally, all of the interests that Hannah was talking about. I'm interested in intercultural dialogue, indigenous knowledge, how it's represented in different domains, different fields, arts and heritage, linguistic recovery, and more recently, digital indigeneity. So the periods of my life and my work that I'm gonna talk to you about is one that was defined by my participation in this project, which was known as the Peninsular Participatory Development Project, or PPDP. That's how we came to be known by people in different parts of the peninsula of Yucatan. The project started in the late 1990s, and the historical background at the time is marked or defined by the Zapatista uprising. And for those of you who are too young to remember, the Zapatista uprising was a guerrilla movement that emerged in the state of Chiapas. It was led by Maya and non-Maya. One of the most prominent spokespeople of that movement was actually a non-Maya person, Subcomandante Marcos. But the Zapatista was backed or was supported by a very wide network of community organizations and groups. And that marked or defined the Zapatista movement as an indigenous movement. In spite of all the different discussions, Mexican intellectuals dismissed this as yet another Marxist guerrilla movement, whereas there was a more complex formation and constitution to the movement if you looked at it from the ground up. So for whatever reason, the Zapatista rebellion created an effervescence, right? So it was a moment, the second half of the 90s in Mexico was marked by discussions about indigeneity, indigenous rights, indigenous languages. A lot of Mexicans were sort of trying to reconnect with the indigenous heritage. There was a big search, and as I said, intellectually, it was a moment of debates about how to make justice for indigenous peoples who were the poorest in the country, who had been suffering from diseases that were curable, much like here in Canada, where you have issues with drinkable water in a country that sends teams of international aid workers to other countries to provide them with drinkable water, and a lot of indigenous nations still lack that. So those debates were at the center of the political life in Mexico in the late 1990s. So that was the source of inspiration for a lot of non-Maya, mostly non-Maya NGOs and academics who decided to, at that point, combine their different levels of expertise and join efforts to create a space, to create a platform to promote participatory development with indigenous, in this case, Maya communities in the Yucatan Peninsula. The goal, as it was established there, was to generate a comprehensive community development proposal in rural communities of the Yucatan Peninsula, right? So it was a combination of different methodologies. On the one hand, popular education. You have heard about Paulo Freire from Brazil, was a popular educator, Marxist-inspired educator who worked with different rural and poor communities in the 1950s, 1960s, 1970s in Brazil. So he's known for having created a methodology for popular education, as it came to be known. Another methodological approach was farmer-to-farmer exchanges. So, rather than promoting technical knowledge, as it was common during the 1950s, where you had, people from the World Bank, like helicopter technicians coming from Washington and the United States, and just promoting the so-called Green Revolution, technological transformation, and so on. There was, in the case of this project, a stronger emphasis on farmer exchanges and learning. There was also participatory action research, which is a research approach that, again, was born in Latin America, most specifically in Colombia, promoted by, among others, Orlando Falsborda, a sociologist, created this type of approach where the whole aim was to gather information, analyze information with the community, and creating change in that way. And finally, there was also a lot of influence from liberation theology. So you can see how left-wing this project was, has all of these different sources of information, and in many ways it was very, had a very radical, at least looking at the sources of inspiration and methodology. Arturo Escobar is a Colombian-American anthropologist. He, in the late 1990s, was already engaged in sort of deconstructing the ways in which development worked in the so-called third world. So one of his most famous books in 1995 was called Encountering Development, The Making and Unmaking of the Third World. And in that book, he uses a post-structuralist approach, post-structuralist analytical framework to look at the ways in which development discourses had created, or rather how the development discourse subordinated different regions in the world, and in some ways mirrored what other anthropologists before him had characterized as the colonial encounter. So the development encounter was a way of Escobar to highlighting the still colonial impulse of a lot of development work in the world, especially after the Second World War, how development objectives, goals, methodologies, and more specifically discourses had been implemented. And what he finds in his research is that a lot of these frameworks mirrored the colonial encounter, right? Where, there were similar dichotomies of civilization and savagery, primitiveness and modernity, and how those dichotomies were somehow reproduced also in development agencies through the developed and underdeveloped dichotomy, right? So that sort of inserted power relationships that was a power relationship that was very recognizable in discourse, right? So what he says is that development, by using terms, apparently neutral terms like growth or progress or modernization, reinforce a unilinear evolutionary line that organized countries according to this measure of development. Numbers of literacy were high or low, income, whether income was high or low, and so on and so forth, right? And by doing that, even when non-Western actors were invited to participate in development projects, the discourse will continue to elevate Westernized expertise above other forms of knowledge or other forms of expertise, other forms of wisdom, if you like, right? The people who encountered in that space didn't have the same power according to the ideologies that dominated. And finally, that development interventions displace and replace or just plainly ignore other forms of knowledge by framing social change almost exclusively in external experts' terms. In my reflection, I can see how that worked out, even having a very left-wing basis, left-wing methodology for many of the projects that we were trying to achieve, how this development encounter played out, even in this project that I was just telling you about. Okay. So just to give you an example, this is the linguistic universe that PPDP, this Peninsula project, used, right? So we have all of these institutions, some of those initials, but we also have terms like endogenous development, human development, children's rights, indigenous people's rights, enculturation, theology, Indian theology, cultural animation and interpretation, and so on. And at the center, we have notions of healthy development, social and moral autonomy, sustainable development, and a notion that is starting to emerge around those times, which is the idea of good life or good living, which in a way was an attempt to articulate a critique, a Latin American critique of the Western influence notions of development, right? But yeah, this is a little bit of that linguistic universe. The project was big. It included close to between 25 and 30 communities from all of these regions in the Yucatan Peninsula. So the project consisted in organizing meetings where farmers from different parts of the Yucatan, Maya farmers, will meet and exchange their knowledge. So, based on that idea of farmer to farmer exchanges, that was still central to this effort. But at the same time, and using those spaces as an opportunity for training, a lot of themes, a lot of topics will be offered by non-Indigenous practitioners to Indigenous farmers, and therefore there will be a space for training, mutual learning, farmer to farmer learning, but at the same time there was still some input from the outside, so to speak, outside of the communities into these conversations, right? And we will meet in different places, right? Sometimes we'll meet in north of Yucatan, sometimes we'll meet in west of Bacalar, in the south, sometimes in the Los Llanes region, which is a region where I worked for nearly 3 or 4 years. And I also worked in the south of Yucatan, the center of the peninsula. So we will be moving and inviting Maya farmers from different parts. And you can imagine that even though Mayatan, the Maya language, is more or less homogeneous, more or less uniform, in many ways, even though we don't have a centralized academy of the language, and the language is not taught according to a centralized curriculum. But people from Blancaflor, for instance, very easily understand people from Motul, people from San Antonio, Sijo, and all of these regions, they will understand each other. And at the same time, they will also recognize that these people were from a different region, right? Much like any other language that is spoken across a big region like this. Within this work, there was a central aspect which consisted precisely on translation and interpretation, right? Because it was very clear for a lot of these non-Indigenous development practitioners that in order for these farmers to sort of begin to prepare for social change, the terminology that they were used to employ as university-trained practitioners needed to be interpreted into Maya. So hence, the Interpretation Commission was established as part of this project with the following mandate. The Language Interpretation Commission was in charge of guiding or advising the interpretation work of bilingual Maya Spanish translators who were responsible of explaining both new concepts as well as the content of the workshops, right? And as I said, in these farmers' meetings, these encuentros, these big assemblies, Maya farmers will come from different regions. They would meet in this space, and then there will be different workshops on, for instance, popular communication, project planning and evaluation. There will be analysis of reality, human rights or gender rights. It will be a menu of different topics that people will offer these promoters that then will be replicated in their own regions. Some of these training or some of these workshops will consist on the application of participatory appraisal techniques. So how to gather information from the community in order to analyze and plan different activities. How to set up, for instance, a project to address malnutrition in the community, or how to set up a project to attack issues or problems related to alcoholism, or deforestation, or contamination of water, or loss of crops, or problems with agriculture, problems with the beekeeping, or different aspects of the economic activity. So the idea was that training all of these promoters, Maya farmers, members of the community, they will be able to lead their own endogenous development process, right? By following all of these techniques of appraisal, techniques of planning, techniques of diagnostic and analysis. So that was all part of the work that the Interpretation Commission had to do, right? Find the language that would allow these promoters to absorb these forms of understanding reality, how they will be able to frame this participatory development approach, right? This is an example, for instance, how interpretation work will happen. So for instance, this is one example. I was going actually through my notes in preparation of this talk, and then you was just looking at this and say, oh my God, how wrong we were in attacking or doing this kind of work, right? So this is an example. When I was working in this project, I was in charge of following up the work that community promoters were doing, right? So I will go to the community and talk to them and say, you know, how did it go? I mean, what did you do, right? So, you know, explain to me and then try to do a systematization of that work. So yeah, we'll go to the community and ask, you know, and at that point, we were just interested in two ideas that were part of the toolkit of participatory development promotion. And one was to appropriate, right? Which is the idea that from a participatory development point of view, one important aspect of that is that people can appropriate the knowledge that comes from outside, right? That was part of, you know, one key notion. So the work of interpretation will go like follows. People will explain first the concept in Spanish and then say appropriating or to appropriate. What does it mean in Spanish? How can we explain that in Spanish? So in Spanish, you would say to make something your own. For instance, to turn some form of knowledge into something that you can identify with, right? So very, I don't know, complex on the one hand, maybe alien on the other hand. Yeah, who knows? But then you will start playing with different forms of explaining the same idea into Maya. So for instance, we have intialintic, which is to make something mine, which in a way expresses the idea, but not entirely. Then for some other people, the interpretation will be uchalbal mutiali, which is to grab something that is not yours or stealing, right? So appropriating in this interpretation becomes stealing. And yet some other people will say berlai intiar, which is today this is mine, right? Which again imperfectly conveys the meaning of what the external promoters wanted to incorporate. Another example, to animate, and this is about popular communication, you know, encourage people to participate, you know, to be open and participatory, you know, to engage, to be able to reach out and to animate process of discussion and analysis from the ground up, right? But then, you know, at the moment of explaining that into Spanish, you would say to encourage, to convince, or to make somebody happy, which is something that some facilitators encounter as a way of grasping with this concept. And then you say admeyan, which is to ask people to work, right? Which in some ways, yeah, sort of reflects the idea of animate. Then, you know, likuyol, which is lift their spirits, lift the spirits of people, to animate. That was the closest. Or to bring yourself to work, right? Which in a way, again, it's an imperfect way of interpreting that notion or that idea that is embedded in a particular methodology and toolkit that is not necessarily that of the community. So there were a lot of problems, right? Many examples of lack of correspondence that happened during that work. And that is also what happened when translating the idea of development, which happened at a later stage in that process. The first attempt to translate development into Maya Tan was to do a literal translation. So again, you can see here how the immediate reference to development, even from a critical point of view, is related to growth and to improvement and to ideas of betterment, right? That are somehow, you can say, correspond to a particular way of understanding change or desirable social change, right? So when we first approached the idea of development from a literal point of view, we came up with ideas of growing, nohochtal, growing in size, right? When somebody eats a lot, it grows. Nohoch is grown, big, and tal is reflexive, right? Nohochtal is to become big, right? Then there's another way of translating the idea of growth, which is il, which means growing, but growing in age or aging. And then finally, the idea of improving, which is maloctal, which is to get good, right? To improve something. If you don't write well, you can get better and then you improve. That's the idea. Doesn't really begin to grasp or capture many of the other levels of discussion that were happening among non-Maya speakers as part of this project. And then came that political reinterpretation of development that went from growth to good living, right? And something that was happening the end of the 90s, the beginning of the 2000s in many parts of Latin America, where ideas, for instance, of summa causai in Quechua started to be used, or summa jamana in Aymara, again in the south, summa causai in Ecuador, summa jamana in Bolivia, or in other parts of Mexico, lequil kuxlejal, in the region of Chiapas, in the Tzotzil language. So that's when you translate development as good living instead of growth, then you can also begin to sort of try to grasp that concept in Yucatec Maya or Maya time. And then you have mal kushtal, which means good life, or masi kushtal, which means a better life. But then again, in the context of the language, mal kushtal is like the life of criminals. It conveys the idea, you have a good life because you steal from other people. You are corrupt. Or there's a moral implication to this particular type of expression that doesn't, again, only imperfectly mirrors the idea of good living that in other indigenous languages may be more straightforward, right? And then finally, we started having larger conversations with people, other forms of understanding what was desirable as a social change for the Yucatan Peninsula would be. And we then started to understand that some of those ways will be better expressed as a balanced life, a life of contentedness, being content. I don't know if there's what's the equivalent in French? In Spanish, yeah, being contento with my life, which is I'm happy, but no, I'm not exhilarated. It's not an exhilarating form of happiness, but it's, a contentedness, which is a sense of being, a balanced being, which means not poverty, but also not excessive wealth. That idea started to emerge from work that we were doing, right? So with information from the community participatory development, we created these tools to create discussions with the statistical information, with a mapping of natural resources in the region. So this is an example of a map that we produce as part of the project, and then we will have discussions with people. We will go to the communities and use the map as a pretext to unpack many of these ideas. And that's how gradually this notion of quote-unquote development as contentedness started to appear. But we were very slow, I have to say. I was probably not prepared to understand how that idea of contentedness could be used or could be the most appropriate form of translation for that which a lot of community Maya members will constantly be talking about in the context of these conversations. It was only after a few years after that project had actually stopped that I was able to understand that good living in Maya time, rather than being expressed literally as mal kushtal or masi kushtal, as it was in the context of this project, could be expressed as kimat olal, which is often translated as happiness, but nobody takes that idea seriously, especially in development context. We're working for happiness, probably something that very few development practitioners will understand, but that's the concept that I think today best reflects that sort of conversation about contentedness, right? To be happy. Or the notion of toh which is often translated as health, but it means something more. It means to live in balance. Toh means straight, and olal is spirit or energy or heart or, and this has also made me sort of critical again of the ways in which we understand translation in the Maya language. There are three forms to say translation. The one that I use for this talk, éext, which means change speech. So those are the two elements. Éext is change, and an is speech or word or language or expression or authority as well. Then the other alternative is sut-an, which means to turn the speech, to switch the speech, to redo the speech, sut-an. And then is tolt-an, which literally means to line up the speech, and comes from tol, which means to explain, to line up, to do calendrical counting, order, advise, paint, or trace, right? So all of these different ways of understanding translation, in some ways, do not reflect either some of the work that needs to go into finding those most appropriate ways of expressing, right? Finally, I have begun to understand that what is important is unatic bishumeatic an, which is to understand how words serve or how useful words are in expressing certain ideas. So when we finished the peninsular project of participatory development, the same network of people began to work in something that we call UCI-RED, and it was actually the topic of my research, my PhD thesis. This was a project that took the analysis of problems and needs that we did as part of the participatory development project, and then developed that into a planning process that will eventually result in an educational-based model that will switch problematic situations into learning needs and opportunities. So from an analysis of the situation, with information, statistical information, community-based information as well, all of that was incorporated into an analysis that eventually gave us learning needs and helped us to create an educational-based model for different regions and for different community groups. In this project, we tried to fully embrace the idea of interculturality, which was interpreted as respect for the other, expanding the capacity to understand other people, cultural differences, creating plans and projects with development, with direct involvement of local organizations. So again, participatory ethos, an appreciation of indigenous culture with knowledge, practices, and values incorporated into the educational project, and that will be used to reconstruct and strengthen the culture and identity of the people involved, right? So all of those elements were part of the view on interculturality that people of UCI-RED, as it became known, had, right? And UCI-RED stands for Universidad Campesina Indígena en Red, which means Peasant and Indigenous University Network, right? Because that was, again, rather than being centralized on campus like here, all of these communities of learning were still linked to their own place, right? But the way in which learning was conceived, and particularly learning needs, were understood in the context of this project was very much in terms of cognitive skills, that is, logical thinking and problem solving, which were thought to be necessary for Maya farmers in order to continue their popular education. And the use of play and drawings was part of a more grounded approach to education, but again, development of cognitive skills through the role of tutors and critical discussions about information and so on and so forth. But it turns out that that way was still very foreign and felt very specifically as part of a development encounter. Right? Here we see other interpretation practices. Like these are from my notes from that time, and this is a workshop in the Yucatan. So the topic is sustainable technology development. The facilitator begins by asking, what do you want to learn from this session? And then a female promoter, this is a community member, a Maya speaker, asks what technology actually means. And then another promoter say, we want to learn what this thing called development, sustainable development is, so that we can teach it to our compañeros. A third promoter asks, how can I talk about this topic with my group? How can I make use of it? So the concept is again from outside of the community, right? And they want to sort of try to grasp it. And then the facilitator says they're going to play a game to explain, or rather to remember, because she has been told that the people attending the workshop already knows what is sustainability. And after playing the game with the promoters, she asks a few questions at the end, such as, was there an even distribution of the resources? Will it be sustainable? So there are questions about how resources are accessed by different members of the community. And then she finally finishes that session by saying that most of what they are already doing as promoters, as development promoters in their own communities, is sustainability. But it's only the work that they do with the NGO that they can be called sustainable technology. In spite of all these participatory aspects of the discourse, the operation of the training was still very much based on external forms of knowledge that were transferred to the people of the community. And this is, a great deal of learning that happens to other forms of practice. This is a model that came out of my own research, asking promoters how they learn what they knew in their own community. What were the processes of learning that were for them more significant? And then they say, I often went with my father to the field. I observed what he did. I pay attention to his orders. I took responsibility for the work that was done. And I tried to remember every time how to do it. And eventually, all of that knowledge came to be part of who I am. And then I started teaching to my children, to show them how to do it, to demonstrate that, and then to advise them how to correct what they were not doing right, and eventually trying to communicate some of those values through stories, through conversation that happen in a very respectful way, right? So all of those different aspects of learning were not present in the work that the Indigenous University was doing, in spite of all the participatory ethos. Many of the ideas that Maya people have about learning are based on the principle of all, which can be interpreted as center, core, the formal heart, the will, and the intent, the sense of intent. But it also means bud, shoot, stem, or stalk, as in stalk of maize, right? If you have grown maize in your life, maybe, you know that when maize grows, it has to grow straight. Because if it grows on its side, inclined, then it becomes prey of rodents and other animals. And eventually will fall, right? But if it grows straight, then that's a healthy growing, right? And many of these ideas are communicated in different expressions related to emotional states in the Maya language, which talk about knowledge and health and imagination and diligence and boredom as well, and etc., etc. So many of these notions are also modeled through ceremony. So there's a ceremony that we practice where a newly born child is incorporated into the family, and there's a ceremony of propitiation. So that what is intended with this ceremony is that the child begins to grow his or her all, right? And there's several metaphors, about opening the all, about sprouting the all, about remembering the all, and about being able to choose when the child is presented with two different paths, right? Bifurcation of roads, right? All of these different elements involved, including word or speech. This is just to say that, again, in terms of learning, not just development as economic or social or political development, but development also as learning and as growing as a person has a different framing in the Maya language as opposed to theories that come from other contexts, right? Not to call them Western because sometimes they are mixed of different sources, but that in the process of analyzing a lot of the things that Maya promoters were telling me about what they knew and how they knew what they knew, I came to discover that for them, learning is part of a natural process of becoming a person, and that learning is achieved not by verbal instruction, but by observation and practice. And the children in Maya communities are not forced to learn, but encouraged to gradually assume more and more tasks in the family so that they become eventually full participants in that family, and eventually ceremonies propitiate that straight growing as beautiful stalks of maize. That made sense for me as part of my research based on the reading of the work of these two anthropologists, Jean Lave and Etienne Winger, and the book is called Situated Learning from 1991. Okay. Closing thoughts. From this experience and from this lived experience that I had, and also, after many years, we're talking about more than 20 years since many of this work happened, this is what I've come to understand. Intercultural interpretation has to go beyond the text, right? And in this particular example, I'm just trying to show you how, in many ways, the text is not just what is written, but also in many ways how a lot of these external concepts were trying to be incorporated into the language of these participatory development projects, right? So language needs to be analyzed and incorporated by looking at the practice, how language is practiced. Because yes, we can take a very abstract notion and I can explain to you animation and appropriation, and then we can try to translate that into Wendat or Ghanaian, but without actually seeing how a lot of these notions and processes actually happen in daily life, will be very difficult to find the right words to communicate one idea to the other. On the other hand, we also need to understand that there are some concepts that they are never going to be translated, or that they are only going to be mistakenly translated, that we need to find, as in the case of the concept of development that I was telling you about, we need to understand what is that notion that could approximate some of these political frameworks that a lot of these non-indigenous organizations were trying to promote, like this idea of sustainable development or human development. Even from a left-wing critique of the concept of development, there was a need to understand how people actually felt about, what is the life that they decide for their own communities and their own families, right? First to understand that, and then maybe come to terms with the fact that those are not perfect translations to the idea of development that many of these other ages were trying to transmit. Again, how the development encounter imposes limits to the possibility of dialogue, even with all these radical left-wing politics that a lot of us had at the time, because we were framing those conversations in the language of development. We lost a lot of these rich alternative perspectives that Maya people, were trying to tell us, even though I was a speaker of Maya, but I was, again, coming from a different position. translating development terminology or terminology from other domains, did that for this particular project. And finally, how mutual learning really demands time, sitting down with people, rediscovering or unpacking whatever universals we think we have as humans, and then a grounded theory approach, which is to see how concepts that I use at a community level in daily life can actually be used to grasp some of these different notions or different concepts of definition. So, yeah, that's what I wanted to share with you.